So welcome back. For those who are joining us, maybe for this second panel, who weren't there in the first panel, I'm Alice PANNIER. I'm the head of the Geopolitics of Technology program at Ifri. I also say to the people in the room, feel free to move to the first rows, because you're all sitting in the back and you will see and hear better if you're in the front. For those joining us both online and in person, there is a live translation from English into French. You can use the Zoom channels or use the headphones in the back of the room if you want to get the translation. So we just heard at the end of the first panel that there isn't likely going to be a pause in the development of AI, not least due to the intensity and the speed of the race and the intensity of the competition. But there may be opportunities for regulation of AI, which was a beautiful segue to the second panel, which is going to ask the question, how can Europe and its partners shape the development of AI, and including the rules and regulations and norms around AI. So we're going to address various questions, including how AI regulations are adapting to the fast pace of technological developments. And obviously, we've all already been mentioning ChatGPT and the disruptive effect that it has had, including on current attempts at regulating AI, not least in the European framework. But we can't think about it only in the European, with a European lens. We need to be thinking globally. As we heard in the first panel, the AI ecosystems are very, very much embedded with one another, entangled, even when we're talking US and China ecosystems. So we need to think internationally and globally and ask ourselves how these attempts at converging on norms are progressing at the international level. And then when we talk about norms, what do these norms actually convey in terms of the principles surrounding AI, and what do we mean actually by human-centric AI and responsible AI? How can they be promoted in practice, and what do they actually mean in concrete terms? So I'm very pleased to welcome a stellar panel again for this to address these questions. We're going to start right away with Mark Scott, all the way to my right. Mark Scott is a chief technology correspondent at Politico, who's joining us today from London. He writes about global tech and politics. Prior to joining Politico, Mark was European technology correspondent for the New York Times, and before that, a London correspondent for Bloomberg Business Week. Mark is also the author of the Politico Digital Bridge, which is a weekly newsletter on transatlantic tech that I can only recommend. It's a great source of information. So Mark, could you give us, please, a bit of perhaps a background on the EU's AI Act and what's changed, perhaps with the recent European Parliament's negotiations on the Act, and how what I was mentioning earlier, these recent technological disruptions, how they've been addressed as part of these negotiations on the AI Act, how to adapt it to generative AI. Let's start with that. The floor is yours for about 12 minutes. Thank you.
I'll do what I can.
Turn it on. Push the button.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Yes, wonderful. Thank you for having me. I hope everyone grabbed some coffee and some of the biscuits outside. They were pretty tasty. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of explaining the AI Act in 12 minutes. Good luck. I speak very quickly, so for the translators at the back, I will slow down. He's nodding his head. There we go. So we need to see the context of the EU's AI Act in the broader digital policymaking of Brussels and the 27 bloc. This is about Europe and the EU in particular trying to expand its remit within digital, be it competition, online content, chips, cloud computing, and AI is just one of those provisions. The idea being, yes, we need to create some sort of regime for within the EU, but the EU has made it very clear that they see themselves, rightly or wrongly, as the West's digital enforcer, the digital police person, officer, and therefore whatever happens within the EU on AI can then become the de facto standards for the West, similar to what they did with GDPR in 2018, those privacy provisions. So that's the background here. The idea, we want to create something for Europe, but it's not just for Europe. We're going to expand it as far as we can and nudge, cajole, whatever is the right verb to use, our Western allies to follow suit. Is that a good thing? We can get into that during the discussion. A lot of this is based around what they like to say a risk-based approach. The idea being there are certain uses of AI to the previous discussion which are very perfunctory and normal, and there's no reason why we need to have some sort of difficult regulatory regime overseeing it. There are others like the Chinese social scoring system where we don't want that at all within the Western democratic system. So there are 4 layers of AI under the AI Act rules. One is banned. So again, social scoring, you're not going to do it. And then it goes down to high risk. And then the other 2 below it in terms of no medium risk or very limited risk or no risk whatsoever. The Commission put its rules together in 2021 to lay out what they thought this should be. Generative AI was not mentioned at all in that. We can get into that in a minute why, but the whole point was we're going to focus solely on both banning the cases where we don't want AI to be used, and when it comes to high risk use cases, autonomous vehicles, uses of AI in critical infrastructure like water and electricity, we're going to make sure that those use cases can continue, but they need to be done in a way that is safe for the European citizens and also comply with fundamental rights. Some of those use cases, as I say, is about allowing this to happen, but you need to then go through some sort of risk assessment. You need to provide transparency and accountability about how you're using that data and what data you are using. So people, both the average citizen, although frankly no one in Paris or Berlin is really going to be looking at this, but the policymakers can hold these companies to account. That was the concept, the idea being go do what you want, but if there are high risk uses of your technology, there are certain steps you need to go through. So that's the background to all of this. And then ChatGPT happened it's been going on for a while, but in the public consciousness was about October, November last year, just as the Parliament was formulating its own version of the AI Act. I hope that, I'm not sure if there are any politicians in the room, but politicians never miss an opportunity of jumping on the latest bandwagon. So all of a sudden, the AI Act had to say something about, foundation models. It had to say something about ChatGPT, and therefore, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly to a degree, the MEPs inserted a variety of provisions specifically related to general AI, which is sort of the all-encompassing AI, foundation models, and specifically around generative AI in particular. Most of that was a continuation of the risk-based approach that was already baked into the AI Act. They just extended it and made it more acute to foundation models and generative AI. And that was to take generative AI as an example. You need to make sure those models and the data in particular is more accountable and transparent, particularly when it comes to the use of, say, copyrighted data in how generative AI is used. You need to be very clear how that is happening, so we don't end up, with sort of potentially copyrighted data coming into these models and creating issues for the owners of that material. So that's where we stand in terms of generative AI. You could argue that, do we need to be explicit around generative AI within the AI Act? I think part of this is political, because everyone now needs to be seen to be doing something on generative AI. So name checking it, referencing foundation models is a clear example of the EU and frankly, the other governments around the world now showing their citizens, their voters, that no, we're taking this seriously, we need to do something. My personal view is that a lot of the questions around generative AI in particular, in terms of data access, accountability, transparency, could already be taken care of with GDPR. A lot of these questions are privacy related. Europe has a very robust privacy regime. Do we need new rules? Maybe. I'm not convinced, particularly on the generative AI question. And so where we are now is that we have 3 versions of the AI Act coming. The Spanish presidency of the EU has till December to try and figure out, in the so-called trialogues to figure out how to make this all work. There's a lot of political impetus. I was in Brussels on Tuesday, and there was a lot of talk about getting this done by December. My view is it's probably going to happen on December 31st at 11:55 p.m. And then everyone's going to say, I bet AI Act, and we'll call it a win. But there's going to be some hard negotiation between now and then. I think some areas that you should pay attention to is the law enforcement element of AI. So we should be very clear the AI Act does not look over military applications of AI for some of the reasons we discussed before, but law enforcement does, and sort of the facial recognition component to AI, particularly in public spaces, is a very hot button topic. And you can understand why from a member country perspective, they would like to have some of those use cases embedded and allowed even in a high risk component, whereas the MEPs, who are typically more populist with a small p, have want those banned for legitimate democratic reasons. And that tension between member countries and the MEPs is historic. Typically, the member countries win, but it will be an interesting debate to see what happens as we go forward. And so I think, I know Alex is going to talk about the wider sort of transatlantic dimension here, but there was a meeting with the EU-US Trade and Tech Council in northern Sweden at the end of May, where the senior US and European officials get together and kind of hammer out some of these things. And the goal now is to formulate some of the AI Act into a voluntary code that the Americans and Europeans will work on together, and then bake into the G7, what they're calling the Hiroshima process, the idea being of create some sort of G7-led initiative around AI rulemaking, particularly on generative AI. That's the backstory in the geopolitics, but within Europe, I think there is a need to be seen to do this. I still remain very skeptical that the existing rules, particularly when it comes to generative AI, are good enough. You may have seen a multitude of open letters, primarily from industry in the last couple of weeks, saying the AI Act is too onerous, you're going to kill innovation, we're all going to move to the US. Maybe, but there are 550 million, frankly, wealthy European citizens who are customers of many of these companies, and we live in a market economy where you go where the customers are. So I still think many of these threats of leaving Europe are overblown. I think this is a lobbying tactic, and what we'll see is over the next 4 or 5 months, specific use cases that industry want to get out of the AI Act being carved off from the AI Act, but specific granular areas that affect singular companies rather than massive changes in the AI Act. This idea of a risk-based approach is going to be here to stay. It builds on GDPR in terms of some of the data and accountability questions. The question I still have, and I know, Alex, you've written about this, is enforcement is key. The way the AI Act is going to play out is you need a well-resourced, technically literate enforcer to hold companies to account. If anything, the European Commission and the European Union don't have that, have never had that. And so to make that stick and to hold the companies to account, you need to be able to have someone to kick the tires, as you say in English. That doesn't exist. And will that be in place by 2026 when these rules come into force? I don't think so. So will it be a paper tiger in terms of great rules on paper, but not really something that people will follow? I don't think so, but I definitely think there's going to be a 3 to 5 year teething space to really get enforcement right. So if anyone expects the AI Act to be the panacea of all the problems for the AI and deep fakes and all these other things, no, but it also is unfortunately, the only game in town, with the Americans not doing anything, the Brits not really understanding what they're doing. I'd love to hear the Indian perspective, but the Japanese are taking a more sort of industry-led focus too. So in terms of the ability for the 27 countries within the EU to punch above their weight, they have a lot of open space to do what they want at the moment. So that's hopefully that was 12 minutes. That's quite a lot to pack into.
Sounds about right. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for reminding us that even should the trialogue indeed reach a common understanding on the act by the end of the year, it won't be the end of the story. And there's a longer story ahead of us after that in terms of implementing any of the regulation. You've mentioned industry. I'd love to hear Benoit BERGERET's perspective on the role of the private sector, if you like, in implementing any sort of AI norms and regulations. Benoit BERGERET is the executive director of ESSEC Business School's Metalab for Data, Technology and Society. Among many other hats, he's also a member of the OECD network of experts on AI and a co-founder and board member of the Hub France IA. Benoit has served as a consultant to the French government on national AI and metaverse strategies. He's trained as a computer science engineer specialized in AI and has started his career in industry at Bull and IBM, among other things, and has founded a number of startups in Europe and the United States. So, Ben, you seem like the perfect person to ask, how to engage the private sector. How can companies, whether they are AI developers or AI users, what sort of mechanisms can they put in place in order to actually be actors of responsible AI? Actually, if you can explain to us what that actually means in terms of AI and data governance, for instance. You've recently co-authored a report published by ESSEC with the American Chamber of Commerce on getting companies on board with responsible AI. So the floor is yours to explain to us how to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I'm very honored to be here, and I want to wave here, not just at the room, but I received some messages. Some people are watching us from behind the web. So hi to everybody. I'm very glad about your introduction because you cut about half of what I was going to say, because it's important to understand the perspective I'm speaking from, right? I'm not an analyst, I'm not a policymaker. I'm originally a scientist in AI. I was discussing with someone, a gentleman in the room, how some 35 years ago, AI code went into the Rafale jet fighter in its early iterations, which I co-authored with a team. So I've been doing AI for a long time, and progressively my passion went away from researching and then coding, and really into the ecosystem and the benefits for society. Over the 20 years I spent in the US, I also gained a pretty solid understanding of Europe seen from the outside, which I think is always an interesting perspective to have. And so when I moved back in Europe, I was fascinated or obsessed about how can I help Europe leverage the benefits of AI. That was in 2017, 2018. Nobody was talking about generative AI. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about generative AI too much because there's more to AI than Gen AI. And so, yeah, my focus and my initial collaboration with OECD was about an analysis about the limitations of the incentives to AI. And really, I want to talk more about incentives than regulation. I think there's two components to helping society, the economy, adopt technology such as AI. Regulation is what everybody's talking about. Incentives, few people are talking about it, and that's been my cross to bear and my message. The only reason I will mention generative AI, and that's the last time you'll hear me talk about it in this panel, is that one of the barriers to adoption of AI in corporations is the lack of awareness of its benefits and the excessive perception of its limitations, right? All the way down to the media hype about AI is too biased, smarter than us soon, etc. The virtue of generative AI is that it doesn't need a corporate policy to be adopted. People start using it, and then they educate themselves really quickly about what it can do and what it cannot do. So I see generative AI besides the huge benefits it's going to bring overall to the economy per se, also as a side benefit, as a kind of a shoehorn into usages for other AI technologies. So that was an interesting point to make. Back to back to incentives. For the longest time in Europe, there was a big blind spot in the incentive programs that were designed, whether by the European Commission or by the local government. What I call the dark matter of the economy was very poorly addressed. What is the dark matter of the economy? It's 60% of the workforce. It's about a third of the value add in Europe. It's the mid-sized companies. In Europe, you have programs that are very well designed for large corporations to get a hold of in industry sectors that we all know, telecoms, energy, air and space, etc., where very large incentives are then distributed in a trickle-down fashion to the supply chain, to the partners, etc. When you look at what these programs actually feed, you see that they feed only a small portion of the economy of the population of mid-sized companies. The vast majority of the mid-sized companies are not part of these filières, as we say in French, which I'm not sure how to translate. And there are other programs that are not so top-down, that are more local, but these mid-sized companies are often too large to benefit from these programs, right? I'm thinking of programs such as PANNIER in France, in the Paris area, for instance, which really addresses smaller companies. So there's a big blind spot here, and I spent a few years trying to think, how can I help with that? And that's how I actually ended up at ESSEC, because one of my conclusions was really educating business leaders early on to AI, to its benefits and its limitations, was the best way to get them to adopt. The problem is the timeline is long. Other solutions included new business model. I experimented. I've been a serial startup founder all my life. And the last startup I started was an applied AI R&D lab in a model that was very different from consulting firms, really bringing deep AI knowledge to quite local areas in the hope to show that it was possible to be successful and that it would be repeated. Unfortunately, the pandemic killed that experiment, and I might restart it. More importantly, I think some governments, and I know Italy has something interesting about tax incentive for mid-sized companies adopting AI. France just announced a program called the AI Booster program, which is precisely aimed, it was part of the Macron announcement, it's precisely aimed at that segment of the economy. So all of a sudden, I'm hopeful about these incentives. Now, to your question about getting companies on board with responsible AI, I'm happy to give away distribute a copy of the report if you think it's interesting to the audience. And it's a tough exercise to try to draw the conclusions in just a few minutes. But first, it's important to mention that it's a very practical guide for mid-sized company leadership, right? And it covers a 360-degree scope in everything a CEO needs to look at if she or he is thinking about adopting AI. The main takeaways are what? First, it must be a company-wide endeavor for many, many reasons. Cultural reasons, but also because of the impacts that need to be anticipated, all the skilling issues, etc. Acculturation of leadership is the #1 priority. You can't embark on AI successfully if you treat it like a side project down in the organization, regardless of what you're going to do initially with it. Data. I heard a little bit of talk about data. I think we totally missed the point by not raising the issues of data much stronger. It's one of the biggest problems in adopting AI. It's data sourcing for companies. A lot of them are not equipped. They don't understand. Data governance, and so on. And so there are solutions. I'm going to come to it briefly. But I think the important point is to understand, and I very much buy into that new theory, that as we had initially one form of capital, finance, then we understood that humans were a different form of capital, right? But now we talk about the human capital, right? We manage humans with processes and control the same way we manage money and finances. Data is a third form of capital that nobody's going to escape from. And if people understand that data is now capital, it's not just capital to the success of a company, but it is a new form of capital that needs to be governed and managed in the same way. So that's a very big outcome. The other outcome is about skills, of course. Everybody hears about the shortage of skills. And in the report, we insist on upskilling and reskilling. The evolution of tools and technologies make it much more easy than before with no-code, low-code tools. To bring the workforce to a level, not everybody needs to have a PhD in AI for a company to be successful at implementing AI. I think that's the message. And of course, after that, there's the AI governance in itself, transparency, accountability, ethics, bias control, and this is a whole area that is being worked on these days. I'm going to stop here. I'm concerned I'm going to be too long.
Could you actually elaborate on that? I mean, these are terms that we hear a lot that don't necessarily mean the same thing to everyone. You know, the subsets or subtopics of responsible AI, the data governance itself, but also the bias control and the like. So it's interesting to get this bottom-up approach, right? To start from the users and those that will actually have to implement any sort of regulation in terms of AI usage for their companies. What does your experience as an AI engineer and as a businessman, what does it tell you in terms of, what have you learned from it in terms of how those concepts can actually be implemented in practice beyond just those general terms that we hear in the political discourse?
I think that's a great question. Thank you. Why are we all talking about responsible AI? Is it because we want to protect our companies against liability, avoid developing liability? Yeah, it's part of it. Are these like principles that define responsible AI? Just values that we assume everybody should like? No. So why is it important? It is important because it fosters trust. And a key to successful adoption of these systems is trust. Not only trust in how they function, but trust in what they deliver. From beyond the technical trust, right? Beyond the deterministic outcome that some people expect from AI systems, mistakenly, I think. But trust that the data has been processed in a way that is fair and non-biased and relevant. And so customers need to trust you as a company if you're going to use AI systems. But your employees need to trust also that these systems which augment them can be trusted, because it's basically their career, right? The job performance they're putting in their hands. I've seen there's a big shortage of skills, as you know, and in one large company in France from CAC 40, we had candidates questioning the company on what was the measures, the ethical framework, and how did they build trust as part of the interview process. And they clearly put it as one of the discriminating factors between employers. So it's a lot about trust at multiple levels.
Thank you so much. Zooming out back to the global scene, we're going to hear from Alex with a US perspective on governance effort. Ben was just mentioning AI adoption as being, if you like, a key success factor for any society as a whole, for individual companies themselves. Something that the US doesn't want to prevent itself from doing is adopting AI, developing AI. And so how is that faring with efforts at regulating AI internationally within the EU and also within the US? So I'm going to give the floor to Alex ENGLER, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institution in DC and an associate fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, where he researches AI policy, also teaching at Georgetown University on AI policy. You recently were in Berlin as part of a Fulbright Schuman Innovation Award in Berlin and Brussels to study EU digital governance. So you're going to be able to bring an interesting comparative perspective. And prior to joining Brookings, Alex was a faculty member at the University of Chicago, teaching data science to policy students. Also a matter of getting the right knowledge in the right place, including for policymakers to be able to manage data. So that's it for Alex, who's going to talk to us about AI regulations debates in the US, how they're evolving, how the private sector viewpoint is factoring in, but also maybe how EU regulation efforts may be factoring into US debates currently. Perhaps also a word on transatlantic efforts at converging, as Marco was mentioning, the recent EU-US TTC meeting that was hoping to come up with a voluntary code of conduct for US and European AI companies. The floor is yours, Alex. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation. Very glad to be here. Very happy to speak to the decision. Thanks to my fellow panelists for their thoughts. So my focus is on AI risk mitigation, management mitigation, mostly by governments. And I'm going to say a bunch of things that are pretty weedsy and technocratic about that, but I want to zoom out for a second and contextualize why I'm talking about this in a way that is very, very distinct from the panel that came before us. I'm going to talk about mostly regulatory efforts and risk mitigation efforts that have very little to do with geopolitics. Their core concern is absolutely not international competition, but rather better domestic governance. And it's worth noting this transition because it really falls more in line with a topic that hasn't come up today, but is, I think, very important and related, which is a global recession of democracy. That is actually really the binding principle that would make you care about strong domestic AI regulatory protections. It is not because we might lose a competition, it is because the default state of AI is actually to erode some of the civil protections that we have. You can see this in really simple ways, like if your cover letter gets analyzed by an algorithm, it is very hard to reason about why you did or did not get a job. Large-scale systems in healthcare and financial services can be discriminatory, and you do not have to look very far to note that all modern pluralistic democracies are struggling with being both pluralistic and democracies. That is very evident in France at this particular moment, as has been very evident in the United States for several years, and basically everywhere you look, we're struggling. This is an unsolved problem, and so discrimination in algorithms, I think, ties directly into that. The pure number of algorithmic services that make decisions about your life is now so high that it is a civic necessity just to understand that they're happening, just to know, to have it be disclosed to you. And AI regulation could do all these things, though very few of them happen automatically. So I wanted to note that that's the broad context of why this issue is so important. There are things that the EU is doing about this very, very actively. We just heard a really good overview from Mark about the EU AI Act. You should note that it's building on GDPR, the data privacy law, which has some algorithmic pieces. Most people don't know that several Uber drivers won a lawsuit against Uber for being, as they said, terminated exclusively by an algorithm. And Uber, that is something GDPR does not allow, which is high impact socioeconomic decisions made without a human in the loop. So actually that is an algorithmic governance that predates the conversation we're having today. And a few other things that haven't come up: platform governance through the Digital Services Act, e-commerce governance through the Digital Markets Act. The EU has taken a one piece of legislation per impactful digital ecosystem approach. And that collectively has led to a pretty thorough, quite extensive regulatory approach. And there are values of things too that we may want to copy in the US. The AI Act, as Mark mentioned, is the most relevant. That is about these high impact socioeconomic decisions, AI in hiring, financial services, educational access, healthcare provisioning, law enforcement, criminal justice decisions. And what the AI Act says is these things have to meet standards. They have to work as advertised. They have to be accurate and robust to new circumstances. You should tell people when they're affected by them. They can't be discriminatory, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, some of the foundation model additions we just heard about. So what is the US doing? Staring across the Atlantic, looking at this sort of dramatic increase in specific legal regimes and regulatory protections. Less, but probably more than you think. Interestingly, this started under the Trump administration. There was an executive order and then guidance from an agency called the Office of Management and Budget that said all federal agencies need to come up with a regulatory plan for AI, and they need to document all of the AI use cases they have. Unfortunately, that guidance was put out in late 2020, and so when the Biden administration took over, their agencies ignored it. They completely ignored the Trump-era guidance. It's useful to keep in mind that while we talk about AI, most people, most government agencies, AI is not their biggest concern. It is like their 70th biggest concern, right? So they have a lot of other things to be doing. And so adding AI often is like an extra thing. And it's usually doesn't come with money. That just comes with more work. And so it's worth noting that some of the agencies often may need help. So the Biden administration actually revisits this. They do it through something called the AI Bill of Rights. And this is from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And the AI Bill of Rights is really important. It is a sort of broad contextualization of everything I've just said. It's why this is so important for democratic governance to take AI risk management and regulation seriously, including voluntary measures and sort of incentives, as well as like how Benoit put it, is not exclusively regulatory, though that's a big part of the government's role. This led to a few things. So the AI Bill of Rights is kind of a declaration of principles, right, which is useful, but doesn't do anything other than that. But it led to some federal agencies taking action. Many federal agencies, like our housing regulator and our finance regulator and our employment regulator, are all putting out bespoke, specific regulations on AI within the restrictions of what they could already do in past law. And that's a significant restriction. It means whatever they could do before, they can apply to algorithms, but it may be hard to enforce. But one good example is that our hiring and employment regulator can say it is illegal to discriminate in hiring in an algorithm. However, the way that their law works, they can really only enforce that on employers. That's an unfortunate mismatch because the vast majority of these tools are built by 10 or 12 vendors of AI systems. And those vendors, they cannot directly target and cannot directly enforce the law on. So some of these things need to be changed. Most agencies also struggle with capacity. They may need more people who understand this, the AI systems well. There's other things we've seen more recently. The White House, along with the Congressional AI Caucus and a group of researchers called the AI Village at a conference called DEF CON, got a bunch of major technology companies to let a bunch of scientists test their large AI models. This includes like Anthropic and OpenAI and Facebook and others, and Hugging Face here from France. And that's going to be really interesting because we actually might get a really sort of near-term look into how these systems work. It's called red teaming, which you can think of as like adversarial testing. These AI Village participants are going to try to hack and break the models and make them do malicious things they're not supposed to do. And that's a good thing. By doing that, we'll learn about how to make them more robust and secure and can be used more responsibly. NIST, our standards body, is doing some interesting stuff. They've actually been testing facial recognition software for like 20 years. And they have comparisons about how it performs on different racial minorities in different circumstances. And that type of testing is also something that the US is considering expanding by, say, maybe taking large language models and running a whole bunch of different tests on them to see if they're like toxic or biased against specific subgroups. So there's sort of a collection of voluntary and research efforts. However, this is everything I mentioned so far is either voluntary or within the scope of what we could do already. And the US is not immune to public salience. Mark mentioned the explosion of interest and conversations following ChatGPT. Congress also noticed. And what you're going to see is maybe 2 or 3 things this year. One, which is lots of congressional offices are going to choose a specific sub-issue of AI, and they're going to put out a bill on that sub-issue in order to get credit for it, right? They're going to like own some issue of AI. It's AI and copyright, or AI and driverless cars, or AI and data thefts, or AI and toxicity or malicious use by terrorist actors. And some of those bills will be good, and some of those bills will be bad. Mostly they will be about political signaling. And I think that's useful because it gets everyone thinking, it gets staff like engaged. The congressional staff have gone up dramatically in their level of engagement. So they're talking to experts and they're hearing about what should be done. All of that's probably quite good. And then I think some of this might pipe into the more impactful intervention, which is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said, we want to do a special process and a special congressional sort of approach to AI, including a bunch of insight forums, which just means expert gatherings in Congress around key issues. And then they're saying currently an expedited legislative process. And digital governance in the US has not exactly been expedited up until now. Our data privacy law failed to pass in late last year, actually because of opposition from Democrats and issues over preemption of a California law. And then we've never gotten really particularly close to passing a platform regime. So it would be nice if we do an expedited process. Might actually, maybe by breaking through the sort of traditional congressional process, we'll get somewhere. And I think it's worth asking, what should we do? And there's certainly some looking to Europe for that. I think I'm kind of going over, so I'll mention in a minute a couple things about collaboration. First is to say the difference between what I just said about the US and the EU is so enormous that collaboration is really structurally limited in our current sort of legal schemes. There are lots of things we can do collaboratively, but Europe having comprehensive legal regimes for all of this and the US is not a super maintainable long-term strategy. As we look at a digital economy that is, about 10% of US GDP, 5 or 6% of EU GDP, and that's going to grow. You can't just not regulate a tenth of your economy, right? In any conceivable way. That's a problem, I think, in our long term. Makes collaboration very challenging. That being said, so I think that needs to be resolved, and nothing I'm about to say about cooperation means that problem goes away. The trade and technology cooperation is good. They're doing something boring and technocratic, which I love and is super important, which is they're working on definitions, shared, literal definitions of what these words mean. And anyone who's tried to work in a group of people around the phrase AI, artificial intelligence, knows that you are just never, absolutely never talking about the same thing. And if you start to be like, oh no, I'm sure we are. I'm sure it's a minor difference in what we mean by these words. And then you get into it. No, it's a dramatic difference. So a thing that the TTC is doing is saying, let's write down what we collectively mean by artificial intelligence, by machine learning, by reinforcement learning, by bias, by toxicity, et cetera, in all these phrases. This is a necessary first step for things like making sure our regulations can be met by a company that wants to do business in the US under our rules and sell the same software in the EU or run the same platform in both. So very necessary first steps, happy to see it. And I think there's also some work on shared testing and metrics. So if we say, hey, this model isn't discriminatory in the US, the EU can say, well, okay, great. We think it might not be discriminatory here too, which good for regulatory protections, good for democracy, good for business function. This is all upside. I think, so that's encouraging. The other thing to mention maybe is the pact. The pact is interesting. I do think it's valuable. This is the idea of the EU and US pushing a voluntary framework in the short term until rules come in. I think there's value in doing that. I think it will lead to, at least in the short term, better and more responsible approaches of companies. I also think that the social media platforms, unfortunately, made a lot of voluntary choices to do responsible things and did not maintain them over long periods of time. And that is unfortunately just something we have to look at. They made a lot of data available to researchers, and then they realized that data was making them look bad, and then they stopped. So Meta and Facebook, Instagram have cut off a huge amount of public information about their services. And then, maybe the best example is what happened to Twitter, right? So Elon Musk takes over Twitter, and public research and public scrutiny into the site just absolutely collapses. And those were voluntary metrics that a lot of people were relying on to hold these companies to some degree of account. So I do worry about the long-term impacts of voluntary measures, even though there is a short-term advantage of bringing some of these together, some of these ideas together. I'll mention just one last thought, which is a lot of this is about regulation. That's sort of the government default. But Benoit is right that we should be thinking more broadly than this. A few examples. If we want responsible AI, we should make it easier for companies. And a great example of what governments can do is support open source code and research into challenging issues of AI. I've been a data scientist for a long time, and data scientists are probably not as smart as you think they are. Like the average data scientist, if there is a package that's called the interpretable machine learning package or the remove bias from your algorithm package, you're going to use that because it's going to make your life easier and you're going to be able to like make your system more responsible faster. That is stuff that we can collectively build and support that will make it the average data scientist's life easier by saying, oh, this responsible AI practice just got a lot faster for me. And so when my boss says, are you moving on to the next project, the next client, the next, right, you're facing normal business constraints, the time it takes to do responsible AI is easier. That is absolutely something we should be encouraging as governments, especially through funding open source projects and research. And the other last one I'll mention is education. I think the pure scale of this challenge is so high that we should be considering global computer science education in K-12, sort of before college. The numbers in the US are very, very low. I think between 5 and 10% of students are in a computer science class at any time in elementary and high school. Maybe 30, 40, 50% take a computer science class ever in K-12, even though those numbers are getting better. I don't know what they are in Europe, but I doubt they're dramatically higher. And I think both for an economic and civic necessity, that is something that we could invest in that improves individuals' ability to interact with an algorithmic society, and also a significant economic advantage that sort of meets the degree of the challenge of sort of an algorithmatized society.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was very complimentary, I think, to the first two presentations, looking both at the top level government, what it is doing, and also how the private sector is actually engaged in its own sort of self-regulating attitude to a certain extent, and giving us a sort of a bit of a decentralized view on what's at stake. Talking about decentralization, let's move out of the Western world. On my right is Trisha Ray, who's a fellow and deputy director at the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the ORF, the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Her research focuses on geopolitics and security trends in relation to emerging technologies. Trisha is a member of the UNESCO's Information Accessibility Working Group, an AI Connect Fellow, a Pacific Forum Young Leader, and a Fellow in the International Strategy Forum of the Schmidt-Futers Foundation. Trisha, please bring in your viewpoint, speaking from India. We just talked about this civic responsibility in a way, and the civic, both the role of AI, the need for AI adoption, and the need for some sort of frameworks to permit this responsible adoption. How is the Indian government currently thinking about both of those trends, i.e. sort of encouraging AI development and adoption, and also perhaps trying to regulate it? It seems to me there's been a back and forth a little bit in the Indian government's approach towards regulation, with the leadership of the G20 currently with India currently being the chair of the G20, and also soon to be the chair of the GPAI, Global Partnership on AI. It seems that India probably has some also international engagement in the books for proposing a certain view towards international norms and regulation in AI. Sorry, Trisha, the floor is yours.
Okay, good. It's audible. Before I jump into my comments, just like quickly responding to something Alex talked about, which was access to researchers for data from platforms. Incidentally, ORF was one of those organizations. We had a partnership with Meta during the last election. We wanted to revive it for this election. But the people we're talking to in the public policy team say, I don't know if I'll have my job tomorrow, so this is not a project I'm prioritizing. So these layoffs have these other like interesting impacts on research as well. Okay, so I'll start by just setting some context on where India is in AI. And often we talk about AI, it's usually US, China, which yes, they are leading in several subsectors and aspects of AI, but India often on these ranking lists is a close third. So India is a pretty big power in AI, but yes, when it comes to certain things like investment, US and China dominate quite a bit. One of these indices is Stanford's AI vibrancy tool, for example, and India is third in that in terms of AI vibrancy. And part of that is just because of skills and the education sector, not education sector, the skills and training that is present for a lot of workers who want to get into AI. So for instance, you can take AI coursework in high school in India now. That's part of the coursework that young kids can also start looking at pretty early. The publications and highly cited publications is another area in which India leads quite a bit. And then again, harking back to something that was talked about in the first panel, most of these papers are co-written with US authors, but China is actually a close second in terms of co-authorships. So that's another interesting just factoid to add on. And then in terms of investment received by AI startups, India is the 5th largest in the world. So again, just some numbers to start off. Now, I'm going to just quickly zoom out. We've talked about the risks-based approach, which the EU has taken when it comes to AI and also like in the GDPR. Often what's pitched as the polar opposite to that is the rights-based approach to regulation. So risks-based is very situational, contextual, but often the impact of AI is not very bounded or predictable, right? So there's this emergence of this user-centered framework for AI regulation, which is applied more evenly and is based on fundamental rights. That said, I'll get to how Indian regulators are thinking about this, but just to quite lay out the terminology before we start that. The second trend I'm going to mention before I jump into the India context is the PR problem of AI, which Benoit also mentioned, which is that you have world leaders saying things like, the nation that leads in AI will rule the world. This is from Putin. This quote was everywhere for a couple of years in research papers. Elon Musk said that AI is more dangerous than nukes. And then, of course, you have the AI pause document that came out. So there's this PR issue that is kind of generating a demand for more regulation, which I think explains a bit of the about turn on India's approach to AI regulation, which I'll come to. So there is no current draft regulation in India. What we do have are a couple of responsible AI approach documents, and these were released by India's Planning Commission of an unofficial think tank called Niti Aayog. And there's two parts to this. The first lays out fundamental responsible AI principles. And this, if you read that first part, you'll think, okay, this is a rights-based approach. Then you have the second part that comes in and says, okay, we've laid out these rights, but actually we want to take a risk-based approach to AI regulation. And this is because the belief is that AI use, the particular sectors in which it's going to be used, and the capacity of sectoral regulators to implement all of this should be taken into account when looking at AI regulation. Now, the EU AI Act has these different risk levels. The AI responsible AI approach papers look at two kinds of risks. One is system or performance risks, which is risks in the design of AI, choice of data sets, so on and so forth. And then the second category is societal risk, which is the indirect impact of deploying some of these systems on wider society. And these are often not predictable, of course, but yes, these are the two categories that the approach paper lays out. Now, what is India's approach to regulating AI? I'll be talking about two ministries in this context because there is no singular approach, honestly, and I think each ministry is kind of doing their own thing when it comes to AI regulation. The main ministry to look at is the Ministry of Electronics and IT, and its approach seems to be quite similar to what Niti Aayog had pitched with its responsible AI approach papers. Initially, in fact, in April this year, in a written response to Lok Sabha, House of Parliament in India, the ministry said that there was no plan to regulate AI. And that was mainly because it's a sector of great economic importance, so regulation would end up harming the growth prospects of the sector. And then in the very next month, METI said that we do, in fact, want to regulate AI. And I can confirm that METI has constituted like working groups. It's engaging external consultants and organizations to help with some of this. So it is, in fact, happening. I'm just puzzled why they said they weren't in April, but it does seem that there's some work happening on the ground already. The second ministry to pay attention to is the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So the Ministry of Corporate Affairs' approach is more ex ante. METI is very post facto. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs is looking at it through a competition and consumer rights perspective, of course. So there was a parliamentary standing committee on finance that actually recommended the EU Digital Markets Act as a model to follow in this space. So it identifies significant intermediaries, gatekeepers, that these platforms that act as kind of they have special responsibilities, essentially, in their development, use, and deployment of AI. So you have these two slightly divergent approaches, and there's an open question of how these approaches would be consolidated. It's likely that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is going to continue looking at it mostly from a consumer rights perspective and is going to encode some of that into those consumer right frameworks that already exist. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Electronics and IT, it seems like, is trying to encode AI regulation into the Digital India Act, which is a Digital Economy Act. And again, it seems like the Digital India Act has become kind of a catch-all for, okay, are you regulating this sector? And the ministry is like, yes, it's in the Digital India Act. So again, let's see what shape that takes. Yeah, and then I suppose the final point I want to make is in relation to some of this international engagement. And yes, as you mentioned, India is going to be president of the GPA next year. And METI is undertaking consultations. I think the second one is later this month. So they're still building that agenda in consultation with civil society, with industry. It'll be interesting to see what priorities it lays out. I have a hunch that DPIs will be part of the engagement, because that seems to be kind of the headline project that the government has been pushing in various forums. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Trisha. It strikes me, listening to the three of you, the four of you actually, that in the end, we may not even, we need a big regulation, but we don't need a big regulation in the sense that actually there are so many different aspects to what AI actually is, that, on the one hand, you have law enforcement, and then you can regulate law enforcement, and then you can regulate AI uses within law enforcement and the like, or you can regulate consumer markets, and you can regulate AI within consumer markets. And do we need an AI Act? Actually, it's an open question. I think you want to react to that. I'll take your reaction to that, and then I'll have some follow-up questions for all of you. And in the meantime, people online and in the room, if you want to start thinking about your questions, we're going to have a mic circulating in the room before opening for the online questions. But Mark, if you had a reaction. Sure.
So I'm not going to win any friends in Europe when I say this, where I think the US is taking a better approach to AI regulation than Europe. And I can see Alex laughing there a little bit. The reason why I say that is I agree with you. And when I look at the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights in the US, it gave specific federal agencies with very good understanding and knowledge of specific sectors a green light to say, these are your principles, use your powers, and go do your thing, right? Whereas the EU is taking a more holistic, horizontal approach where we want to just like start something new and just get everything in there. And it's like the umbrella approach of throwing everything into the bucket, but they haven't thought through the enforcement procedure. So you end up having a wonderful sort of horizontal rule book, but no way to enforce it into specific use cases on financial services, health, etc. And so as much as I wish the US would get their act together and pass some rules, the federal agencies are well positioned, although not well resourced, to take the principles of the blueprint, AI blueprint, the Bill of Rights, and then just go off and do their thing. My concern with the European approach is by trying to do everything all at once and also then wait until 2026 to actually enforce it or implement it, the world looks a very different place in 2026 than it does now. And so that's why I say, honestly, the US is doing this better right now.
We don't often hear that when it comes to regulation in general. If you have some quick reactions. And then
just quick reaction to what you said. Thank you. I think the EU is just following the path of GDPR. What worked really well for protection of personal data, they just built from there. I don't see how GDPR could have been implemented through different agencies or ministries. So I think the jury is still out on the approach, but yeah.
I was on a panel yesterday with Dragos Tudorache, one of the two parliamentary co-rapporteurs for the AI Act, and just sort of me channeling him a little bit in like the why. I think there's a few things that are worth keeping in mind. I think these are valid arguments. One is that the legal system in the European Union doesn't allow the same level of adaptation of pre-existing law to like new problems with algorithms. I am not a European lawyer, but I've heard that enough that I feel like that's somewhat plausible. And then secondly, there's a much larger harmonization challenge here, which is that the EU sees its role as harmonizing the single market. And so if you don't have a law for AI and 7 of your member states pass a law for AI, well, the EU isn't doing the thing the EU is like explicitly supposed to do. So I'd say that those are two sort of broad reasons that have pushed the EU to do this a little more quickly. That being said, Mark's comments about the sectoral nature are absolutely right. And the US is much better positioned because of strong central regulators to do narrow application-specific guidance. And by that, I mean, this is like really in the technocratic weeds, but it's so important. The rules for an AI cover letter analysis system have almost nothing in common with a healthcare provisioning system. And if you are regulating them the same, you are doing something wrong. And we can kind of start at a really specific level done by sectoral regulators in a way that the EU has to go through a much more complicated process to do and still may not be able to do ultimately or be somewhat difficult to do. Now, the one part I push back on is when you don't have any new legal guidelines, if you don't have a law that says you're allowed to go, most agencies may not have clear legal authority to say, hey, we think you may not be following the law. We're going to come collect your model objects and your data and do an inspection or an audit. That's something that you can easily imagine that our old laws that we're kind of adapting sometimes don't explicitly say, which makes enforcement very hard. That's just one example, but there's lots of times where we may need certainly some new legal capacities in the US to get close to anywhere near as a thorough protection system as what the EU is developing.
Thank you, Alex. I'll throw my 2 questions to the speakers. And in the meantime, we're going to gather. I'll throw my first questions. To Mark, actually, since you're speaking from London, where you're based. Curious to hear your thoughts on the UK system or approach to regulation. Recently at the Vivatech conference, Emmanuel Macron mentioned the UK 3 times in his speech about AI, saying that the UK somehow has a good approach to AI regulation and AI development. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But hold those thoughts. I have a follow-up question as well to Benoit about the French position as well. I'm calling you because you're the French person on the panel. May not be the best to answer that. If you want to answer, please feel free. So the French Senate has been pushing facial recognition authorization law as part of the Olympics in 2024. In the meantime, almost 2 days apart, the EU AI Act, after it went through the parliament debates, decided to ban the use of AI for facial recognition. How do you see potentially, if you have any thoughts on that, that we can, or Mark actually, if we can bring those viewpoints together, the French viewpoint on let's allow certain like law enforcement practices, including AI for facial recognition, or whether the stricter viewpoint of the EU Parliament can prevail. I saw at least two hands. Where do we have a microphone somewhere? Yeah. So here and there, please.
Thank you very much. My first question will be on India then. The governments, the Ministry of Defense issued last year 75 new products, powered AI products. But you can see, looking in more details, that most of them are coming from public sector-owned companies like Bharat Electronics Limited. Is the private sector in India willing to contribute to the AI race for the military?
Thank you. And Monsieur au deuxième rang.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Mark Essig from the defense industry. I'm not so optimistic that we can reach a kind of AI act in Europe, especially because of GDPR. For me, GDPR is antinomic with the AI for Europe. Compared to some other countries, we don't have this type of GDPR. And secondly, the AI technology today is dual used. There will be tremendous needs for defense. What will be, there will maybe think to say that AI technology will fall in the ITAR for the US and in the export license regulation for the other countries, which limit and which in fact regulate the usage of AI. What do you think of that?
So if I summarize your question is how to approach defense-specific AI products in regulation and in trade and trade restrictions to defense-specific AI products. Okay, thank you. So we have, did I see another hand? Yeah, Alice.
Hi, Milo Rignall from Institut Montaigne, Paris-based think tank. I have a question related to the best way to move ahead on EU-US cooperation. And as you were saying, in the absence of both sides having similar legislative or regulatory frameworks, it seems like other tools are best positioned to move ahead together, in particular, shared definitions, standards, and evaluation tools. In the context of the TTC, there's the shared roadmap to build a kind of common framework with common evaluation tools, so that both sides, whether or not they're legally bound to do so, can at least have a kind of common set of definitions and tools to work on. On the US side, there's the NIST that's been working on this. On the EU side, it's less clear who's driving this. The question would be, to build these kinds of evaluation tools, who would you kind of want to see working on this? And how optimistic are you as to whether or not this will move forwards? Thank you.
Merci. Who wants to take the floor first? Mark?
I will channel my inner Union Jack and speak for all of the United Kingdom. I joke. I think the Brits are channeling their inner Indian policymakers when it comes to the about turn and 180-degree change in their AI policy. In March, the UK government put out a very pro-industry. We want you to come and do everything you want with us, and you can have a sandbox, and there's no rules, and there's a massive Brexit dividend. 2 months later, when they realized there was a global pushback against generative AI, they are now reading from my notes here, the global leader in AI regulation. I will leave the jokes aside, but the UK government doesn't know what it's doing in this space, mostly because it wants its cake and it wants to eat it as well. And so again, I think maybe they're having chats with New Delhi on this stuff. But I think it does go to the point where every government wants to both be the center of innovation and get those industry dollars, but it also wants to be seen as protecting citizens. And your point about, I have a question for you, but we can maybe talk afterwards, about consumer-driven legislation and protection versus and sort of different approaches is very key to this, because you can have different approaches to regulation. All are fine, but they are different ways of looking at this. And I think we don't have a clear answer. And to the question about the UK, they want both. Unfortunately, they can't have that. They need to make up their mind.
Who's next? Okay.
That's a really interesting point about the UK from Mark. I'll just add one thing I like about the UK is doing is they did do something I appreciate, which is they started hiring first. So they actually have hired a ton of people like to work at their digital markets coordinator office, which is what I think they hired like 200 people already, or moving up towards 300 for a bill, their online safety bill that hasn't passed yet. And I will say that is a refreshing change of pace to like build the internal government capacity, just because you know this is going to be important. And I wonder if other that's one takeaway from governments that the sort of context about the switch. I think Mark's making a very fair point about their broader political signaling, but government capacity wise, maybe a lesson to be learned there. I'm going to take the cooperation question, and I think especially the question that's particularly interesting in that was who should develop standards for AI systems in the service of cooperation or in general. This is something that is also harder to do without some sort of legal framework. So the Digital Services Act says that if you're a large online platform in the EU, over 45 million EU active users, then you have to make the data for your platform available to independent academic researchers. And this is really important because it is extraordinarily hard to understand platforms like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and Amazon and others from the outside. Your experience is not the same as my experience, is not the same as anyone else's experience on this panel. So you have to get, anecdote is not enough. You have to study these things at scale. That means getting the data. And that is a super useful process. And the EU, by doing that, will unquestionably know more about how online platforms function than basically everybody else. And the researchers who get access to that. And I will say, they will be very well positioned to write things like, hey, these interventions worked to reduce disinformation and these did not. Better positioned than most. And I would actually say, as a point of towards cooperation, it would be amazing if the EU let in some US researchers on that project. We would be very grateful. And I actually think that US philanthropies would even support that type of work, because it's so hard, that data access is so hard that it's actually such a key question. And you should see what researchers are doing to get around this. They spend like years collecting data with like thousands of individuals participating in studies, all because you can't get direct access. I say this because the legal framework itself helps learn. Another example from the EU AI Act, the EU, all the applications that fall into high-risk AI, they have to register with an EU-wide database. So every hiring system and workplace management system, healthcare provisioning, educational access, that whole list, if you build an AI system and sell it in the EU, you have to register, and that list is public. That's about to be the single best resource on the extent to which our society has sort of algorithmatized in these high stakes socioeconomic decisions. Another area where the EU, because it's regulating, is actually going to know much, much more. And hopefully some of this information transitions over. But so the EU, I think, is going to be able to figure a lot of this stuff out. A really good question is, how does the US create standards when we're sort of locked out a lot of these systems? I think that may actually be the trickier part. It's a really good question.
Trisha?
Okay, so to the question on will private companies be helping or driving AI innovation in defense in India? One, just to zoom out quickly, in 2017-18, several ministries constituted their own AI task forces. The Ministry of Electronics and IT's task forces report was kind of the precursor for the AI strategy that eventually came out. The Ministry of Defense also had an AI task force. The report was not made public, But I hear that incentivizing startups and private companies to grow and to supply to the defense sector was one of the recommendations. And in fact, there have been several defense innovation challenges where startups have received funding to develop a product that would eventually be supplied to the Ministry of Defense or any of the entities that work under it. So there is a concerted effort, but public sector undertakings, PSUs, do still have the lion's share of a lot of that pie, so to say. Yeah.
Yeah, just there was the question also on the, yeah, you want to take that one?
Defense. I'm not a defense reporter, but I've covered European policymaking for more than a decade. So I always feel that EU rules in particular are more guidelines than rules when it comes to defense, particularly with large domestic industries like France has. So my view on that, and I can't speak to the Olympics facial recognition component, is if the defense industry wants to use it and there are backing within senior levels of national governments for that to be used, even on the dual use case, there'll be a fudge where it'll happen. That's not helpful for industry, I presume, because you want certainty. But my decade plus experience looking at EU policymaking shows that that always happens. And so why would AI be any different? Can I just come back to your question about cooperation? I think, again, I'm going to channel my inner Alex and go super wonky here for a second, so forgive me. NIST in the US is running the show on definitions. There isn't really a European counterpart, and the NIST people are very good. So expect them, if you want to know what's going to happen on the definition side, go there. I'm coming up with this idea in my mind called the puppy paradox, where everyone in the world wants a sort of AI ethics and principles, because who wouldn't want that? Like, who wouldn't want a puppy? Like, who doesn't want AI ethics? But the problem with the puppy paradox is it just doesn't work, because when you push comes to shove, ethics, recommendations, and accountability, transparency need to be turned into something meaningful. Definitions, use cases, what NIST is trying to do, and then being exported out. So for me, we should look past the puppy paradox of, the UNESCO AI principles, or, even, to a degree, GPI, because it's not specific enough. And if we're going to do cross-border AI rulemaking, get past the grandiose stuff, focus on the nitty-gritty and the wonkery. I think that's where real meaningful action can happen.
It's actually a nice segue to a question I was going to add to Ben's load on the OECD work. Since you've been a member of the OECD AI working groups, could you talk a bit about how you see that work progressing at the level of the OECD? Can we move beyond broad principles that indeed have little use in practice if they're not sort of tailored for specific sectors or uses? And also perhaps on just also the governance of this OECD work and engagement with the private sector also within GPay, how that's working out. That's also a way to escape maybe the other question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But first, I wanted to ask you a question, actually, about defense. When I was looking carefully at the AI Act, it looked like very clearly to me that national security risks were excluded. So that would, answer in good part your question, I believe. To your question about facial recognition, I think, two things. One, my understanding of the chronology is that back at the end of last year, the French government dropped the plan to use facial recognition, and then came back with a different technology, which used biometric indicators, non-facial, to do that. And so, it's actually not easy, but understandable how you can track silhouettes based on the color of clothing, the hair, etc., without looking at the face, and looking at the movement, right? That's the core of that system is going to be to try to determine someone who's engaged in something that a machine learning system has learned is suspicious and leading to crime. But that raises a more difficult question, which is one of the big problems I have with the AI Act, which is we cannot anticipate all usages or all technologies. And so is the AI Act doomed to become a constantly evolving repository of risks and forbidden usage, or you know, I think that's a very significant issue, and I would love to hear you guys about that. Now, for the OECD question, I'm not at the core of the work, right? The network of experts is consulted through commission work on a variety of topics. All I would say is that we have a couple of nice things to our credit. I think the EU ended up adopting, to your point about definition, the OECD definition for AI, which I think the One AI group is pretty happy about, because that was a commission work.
Thanks so much. Anyone wants to react on? See, I've lost my point.
I'll go from channeling my inner British policymaker to my inner European policymaker with my Irish passport. I think you're right about the EU AI Act. The one thing about sort of the common law, Napoleonic law system is it's very brittle and it's very difficult to change. And as much as, the Anglo-Saxon in me quite likes, the sort of US British approach to sort of risk-based, principles-based legislation, that's not what the European Union does typically. And so what we've seen, at least with GDPR, is that as much as people want to reform it, they just can't, because as a commissioner put it this week, they didn't want to open up the Pandora's box. So you can imagine on AI, an AI Act which has specific, high-risk use cases, all of a sudden in 2 years' time, there's a litany of new cases. To open that up will then extend to more lobbying and postpone the inevitable. That doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. It's just we should be honest with ourselves, the limitations, and the fact that generative AI was not even name-checked at all in the initial commission documentation. And frankly, I don't think it should have, but it shows how quickly things change within 18 months.
At the risk of looking extraordinarily stupid in the future, I'll say I don't think AI is changing as fast as most people think it is. A lot of the high-risk categories of AI covered by the EU AI Act are in their 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th year of use. The first medical school to use an algorithm in educational admissions was in the 1970s. The adoption of machine learning, tree-based methods into consumer finance was in the 1980s. Most of these examples go pretty far back. That does mean we will need to update them and create more, but there are ways to write this that I think are a little more future-proof than we give it credit for. Even large language models, like the thing we're all talking about now, which can be described as generative, they can be described as foundation models. They're a type of those. The original paper that moved us in this direction was probably, the method stems most recently from 2012-ish. There's a paper called Glove in 2014. These models absolutely existed in 2017. So at a minimum, that is 6 years. And that is the most recent acceptable definition I can think of. So that's new, but it's not like insurpassably new in the scope of regulatory timelines. And I look forward to this clip being showed to me later, as I look very dumb in retrospect.
Ben, do you have two fingers on that before I give the floor to Trisha?
Yeah, just to give you an example of something that's coming and that's going to question the whole thing. Some people in deep labs are working on new architectures, namely, for instance, JEPA at Meta, which are systems that are not LLMs at all. They're brand new architecture because they embed what these people call word models, right? They embed much more context. So the whole paradigm we know for LLMs that learn from a text that exists. The regulation is not going to cover things that don't exist yet conceptually. And it is a field where the law of physics don't apply, right? Because we're in the pure creativity and mathematics. And that's my concern. There are already signs that the new version of the AI Act is not going to be enough as soon as these come to market.
Just a tiny last point, if you don't mind. I think this is a fair point. And I'll even criticize my own point and say the best parts of the AI Act are the ones that are about, that are really risk-driven. They're about preventing harm in specific situations. And the AI Act, I think I broadly support the foundation model part, but it is not, the argument isn't as clear. It's less risk-based, actually. It's more like these models exist, they seem like they're going to be used in everything. Let's make sure they work well. It's not because everything they're being used for is high risk. People use them to generate poetry and people use them to like generate fashion recommendations. I don't care about those. I don't think government should be wasting time really concerning itself with that. The idea is that they're used so frequently we should govern them. And I agree that raises more technological definition challenges because it's about the technology specifically. That's more likely to age poorly. However, in the high risk category and a lot of the bans, very technology agnostic. And that's especially true in the Parliament version, because we haven't mentioned this, but there's actually 3 versions of the AI Act right now, which is fun. It makes all this very hard.
Trisha.
Yeah, so I'll just pick up perhaps on the broader theme of the need for regulation or not, either way. I just want to briefly reflect on, in the Indian approach, what I see as like a very glaring gap right now. So we've got consumer rights kind of covered by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. We have private companies and the digital economy being tackled by the Ministry of Electronics and IT. But there are already use cases of AI being deployed in law enforcement, for example, that are extraordinarily worrying, and there are no guidelines for them in the country. So, for example, the police in the city of Lucknow in India piloted an AI pattern recognition system that they claim detects women in distress so that they can send police to the area to assist. I have no idea how they categorized women in distress and how they figure out if this woman in distress needs police assistance. But again, worrying thing there. Then the National Crime Records Bureau and the Ministry of Home Affairs. And again, I'm not sure what the status of the project is now, but in 2018, they had announced the creation or the attempted creation of a kind of unified database of information that would help in tackling crime across state borders. Again, very worrying. And the last thing I heard about that was that they were struggling to find a vendor to build this database. But again, there are no regulations, there are no standards. So certainly these gaps need to be addressed.
So we don't necessarily need an overall, overarching, horizontal, big AI Act, but we need to make sure that if we take a more sectorial or decentralized approach, that there is no massive gap in the middle. So we're 1 minute away from the end. And perhaps a good way to end would be to each of you to ask in one word, how would you qualify the state of, I don't know, national or international, your choice, attempts at AI regulation? From everything that we've said, one way to qualify the way things are going.
I'm a very cynical person. And also I got up very early this morning, so I'm very tired. But I'm actually more optimistic than I've come across in this panel. I think we also need to understand, at least within the sort of the democratic world, there is a consensus now around accountability, transparency, and sort of the ethics of this technology that didn't exist when social media, appeared sort of a decade plus ago. And so as much as I remain very skeptical about some sort of broad brush international corporation and we all hold hands and create an AI rule for everyone, no. But if India goes one way and it is sort of based on the similar, collective ethics that the US is doing, I'm fine with that. That's fine. There will be as long as we all agree, like all democracies do, about accountability, transparency, there'll be friction, but inevitably we're all pulling in the same direction. And if you compare that to, say, a Chinese authoritarian approach, we should be honest where, yes, we disagree, but we agree more than we don't.
Great, thank you for the optimism. One word, or maybe 3 or 4, but perhaps fewer words than Mark, if you can.
I don't believe in the feasibility of a global AI regulation, and I think the model of that was used for the nuclear weapons agreements have shown their limits. There will always be someone ready to break that. So, in one word, I trust individual cultures. Even though I don't see the path.
So yeah, what would be the need of a big overarching international agreement if everyone needs to break it? I see.
I would just say that this is very incipient, right? We're still very much at the beginning of this process. It will probably be something we talk about and do for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Seems totally reasonable. I think we probably have more time than much of the news suggests. And so that's probably not a bad thing. Things are going okay so far.
All right. See you next year then, Alex.
I think my fellow panelists have provided plenty of excellent adjectives for the state of global cooperation. I'll just quickly comment then on India, I suppose. At present, the approach seems confused, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that has characterized Indian policies in the past, and it has always gone through iterations and eventually made some sense at the end. So the digital data protection, personal digital data protection bill, for example, makes a lot more sense now. The government rolled back localization provisions because they realized that there is literally no economic sense in having those provisions. I feel like AI regulation or draft regulation in the country will go through these iterations as well. And again, the government has been engaging with experts, people who know the field, and I am confident that something decent will come out at the end of this process.
Let's trust the process then and be patient about the outcomes. Thank you so much to the 4 of you. Thank you to the audience, both online and in the room. It's been a great day. Thank you to the colleagues, Barbara, Mena, Nicolas, Cathy, to both our interpreters. I'm probably forgetting people, the interns and collaborators who've helped with the microphones. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone major. Thank you again for taking the time, for coming here from various faraway places and closer places, and look forward to seeing you at the next debate about AI regulation in the years to come, and have a good evening. Bye.